In the final decades of the 19th century, the United States underwent a transformation so profound that many believed they were witnessing the birth of a new civilization. The scars of the Civil War were slowly fading as the nation embraced industrialization at an unprecedented pace. Steel factories belched smoke across Pennsylvania, oil derricks sprouted throughout Texas, and railroads stitched the continent together with iron and steam. This was the Gilded Age, a time when fortunes were made overnight, and American cities grew at a rate that defied imagination. Between 1870 and 1900, New York City's population doubled. Chicago's multiplied by 7. The skyline of every major American city reached upward as architects and engineers mastered new techniques for building structures taller than any in human history. Yet beneath the gold leaf and optimism lay a darker reality. In the shadows of these gleaming new metropolises, poverty and exploitation festered. Immigrants arrived by the millions, often ending up in tenements where disease ran rampant and opportunity remained elusive. The gap between the palatial mansions of industrialists and the squalid conditions of their workers created two Americas, one of unprecedented wealth, the other of desperate struggle. It was in this contradictory moment, this age of both remarkable progress and profound inequality, that America would encounter a new kind of monster, one born not from superstition or ancient evil, but from the very modernity the nation celebrated. Part 1. The Making of a Monster. Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, a place of rolling hills and conservative values. His parents, Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price, were devout Methodists who ran their household with rigid discipline and religious instruction. By all accounts, they were respected members of the community, his father a farmer and trader, his mother a homemaker with a talent for organization. The Mudgett home stood apart from neighbors, isolated on a hillside that offered young Herman both solitude and a sweeping view of the countryside. Here, in this seemingly pastoral setting, something went terribly wrong in the development of the boy who would one day become America's first documented serial killer. Early accounts of Herman's childhood come primarily from his own autobiography, a document riddled with fabrications and self-mythologizing. Yet certain patterns emerge that bear the ring of truth. He claimed to have been bullied severely as a child, singled out for his intelligence and sensitivity. Whether factual or not, these stories reveal his lifelong tendency to position himself as both victim and superior being. More reliable are the reports of Herman's unusual fascination with anatomy and death. Local children would later recall how the boy would dissect small animals with unsettling precision and detachment. When confronted, he claimed scientific curiosity, an explanation that seemed plausible given his obvious intelligence. Education came easily to Herman. He excelled in the local schoolhouse, demonstrating an aptitude for science, mathematics, and persuasive speech. Teachers noted his abilities, but also his peculiar isolation from peers. He didn't form close friendships, preferring instead to observe social interactions from a distance, studying human behavior as dispassionately as he had studied animal anatomy. At 16, Herman took a teaching position in a small school not far from Gilmanton. Though barely older than some of his students, he commanded respect through a combination of intelligence and an unusual charisma that would serve him throughout his life. It was during this period that he also courted Clara Lovering, the daughter of a prosperous local family. They married on July 4, 1878, when Herman was just 17 and Clara 19. The union produced a son, Robert, the following year. But domestic life failed to anchor Mudgett's restless ambition and darkening impulses. By 1882, he had abandoned his family and enrolled at the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery in Ann Arbor. The late 19th century was a transformative period for medical education in America. The germ theory of disease was gaining acceptance, antiseptic procedures were being standardized, and the profession was moving toward scientific rigor. Yet it was also a time when medical schools had minimal entrance requirements, abbreviated curricula, and little oversight. At Michigan, Mudgett discovered an environment perfectly suited to his temperament and ambitions. Medical education of the period required intimate familiarity with human cadavers, a subject that held particular fascination for him. While other students approached dissection with necessary solemnity or barely concealed disgust, Mudgett displayed unusual enthusiasm. It was here that he first learned to manipulate the systems designed to protect the public. He found that medical schools asked few questions about the origins of cadavers, creating an opportunity for unscrupulous students. Mudgett reportedly began stealing bodies from the university laboratory, disfiguring them beyond recognition and claiming they had died in accidents to collect on insurance policies he had fraudulently taken out. After graduating in 1884, Mudgett began a period of wandering and escalating fraud. He practiced medicine briefly in various Midwestern towns, always departing suddenly when suspicions arose or creditors closed in. During this period, he perfected schemes involving pharmacy fraud, real estate swindles, and promissory note scams, building a repertoire of deceptions that would finance his later activities. It was also during this nomadic phase that Herman Webster Mudgett began experimenting with new identities. He used variations of his name and entirely fictitious ones, discarding them when they became liabilities. By the time he arrived in Chicago in 1886, he had settled on the name that would enter the annals of criminal history, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. The transformation was complete. The isolated New England boy was gone, replaced by a confident, charming physician with piercing blue eyes and a mustache styled in the fashion of the day. Holmes presented himself as a successful businessman and medical practitioner, his soft-spoken manner and professional demeanor inspiring immediate trust. No one who encountered him in Chicago suspected that behind the pleasant facade lay a man who had already committed untold frauds and was nurturing much darker ambitions. As America rushed headlong into its future, Henry Howard Holmes had arrived in the perfect city at the perfect time to exploit the blind spots created by rapid growth and relentless progress. Part 2. Chicago, the city of possibility. When Holmes stepped off the train at Chicago's bustling Union Station in 1886, he entered a metropolis in the midst of a historic transformation. Just 15 years earlier, the Great Chicago Fire had destroyed much of the city's central business district and left a third of its population homeless. From these ashes rose not merely a rebuilding of what had been lost, but an entirely new vision of what an American city could be. Chicago embodied the nation's post-Civil War reinvention. It was raw, energetic, and relentlessly forward-looking, a place where ambition mattered more than pedigree. The population had exploded from approximately 300,000 in 1870 to nearly 1 million by the time Holmes arrived. Each week, thousands of newcomers poured in from across America and Europe, drawn by the promise of employment in stockyards, factories, and construction. The city's geography proved ideal for its explosive growth. Positioned at the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan, Chicago became the natural nexus between eastern markets and the agricultural bounty of the Midwest. More than 30 railroad lines converged here, making it the busiest rail center in the United States. The Union Stockyards, opened in 1865, processed more meat than any facility on Earth, earning Chicago the nickname Hog Butcher for the world. This was also the era when American architects were revolutionizing construction techniques. The world's first skyscraper, the 10-story home insurance building, had been completed in Chicago in 1885, utilizing a steel frame that allowed buildings to rise higher than ever before. When Holmes arrived, the city's business district was already sprouting these new structures, creating a skyline that symbolized American ingenuity and ambition. For a man of Holmes's particular temperament and skills, Chicago offered something equally valuable: anonymity. In a city where thousands of new faces appeared each month, where people reinvented themselves routinely, and where credentials were rarely verified thoroughly, Holmes found fertile ground for his schemes. He could blend into the urban fabric while carefully selecting victims from the constant stream of newcomers, particularly young women arriving alone to seek employment in the booming city. Holmes first found work at a drugstore on the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets in Englewood, then a prosperous suburb on Chicago's South Side. The proprietor, Dr. E.S. Holton, was elderly and in poor health. When Holton died, Holmes convinced his widow to sell him the business. Some accounts suggest Mrs. Holton simply disappeared afterward, possibly Holmes' first victim in Chicago, though historical records remain inconclusive on her fate. With the drugstore as his anchor, Holmes began acquiring adjacent properties, eventually controlling much of the block. He presented himself to the community as a successful pharmacist and businessman, earning the trust of neighbors and establishing credit with local vendors. Few questioned his background or credentials in a city where enterprise was valued above all else. In 1887, Holmes hired a carpenter named Benjamin Pittersall as his assistant. Pittersall, a troubled man with a drinking problem and a family to support, became Holmes's loyal accomplice in various schemes. Their relationship would continue for years, ending only when Holmes murdered Pittersall in one of his most elaborate insurance frauds. By 1888, Holmes had begun construction on a building across from his drugstore, a structure that would later become known as the Murder Castle. To architects and contractors, he described it as a hotel and retail complex intended to capitalize on the upcoming World's Fair. The building's true purpose, however, was far more sinister. Chicago, in the late 1880s, was consumed with its bid to host the world's Columbian Exposition, a fair intended to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World. When Congress selected Chicago over New York in 1890, the city entered a frenzy of preparation. The fair would bring unprecedented attention and visitors, and Chicago was determined to showcase itself as America's city of the future. For Holmes, the World's Fair represented the perfect hunting ground. Millions of visitors would flood the city, many of them young women traveling alone for the first time. In the excitement and confusion, disappearances could easily go unnoticed. His hotel would be perfectly positioned to capture both legitimate business and unsuspecting victims. As Chicago rose, so did Holmes's ambitions. And as the city looked toward its moment in the global spotlight, he methodically prepared for a harvest of victims unparalleled in American criminal history. Part 3. The Construction of Evil. The building that rose at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets appeared unremarkable from the outside. A 3-story structure with retail spaces on the ground floor and rooms above. But what distinguished Holmes's building was not its exterior, but its interior. A labyrinthine design that reflected the twisted architecture of its creator's mind. Construction began in 1889 and continued, with modifications, for several years. Holmes personally oversaw every aspect of the design, making frequent changes that baffled contractors. He insisted on hiring multiple construction crews for different portions of the work, ensuring that no single builder understood the complete floor plan. Workers were routinely fired after completing their assigned sections, preventing anyone from grasping the building's true nature. The result was a structure engineered for murder. The upper floors contained nearly 100 windowless rooms, many accessible only through trapdoors and secret passages. Some rooms were lined with asbestos, making them soundproof and fireproof. Others were connected to pipes that could deliver gas from a central control panel operated by Holmes. There were rooms that could only be locked from the outside, and staircases that led nowhere. In the basement, Holmes installed a dissection table, chemical vats, and a crematorium disguised as a furnace for heating the building. Chutes connected upper rooms to this macabre workshop, allowing Holmes to transport bodies effortlessly. An underground pit filled with quicklime and acid provided another means of disposing of human remains. Perhaps most disturbing was Holmes's office, a seemingly normal space that contained an array of surgical tools and a stretching rack. Here, according to later testimony, he would sometimes torture victims before killing them, combining his medical knowledge with sadistic impulses in experiments that remain mercifully obscure in historical records. The building was completed just as Chicago prepared for its moment on the world stage. The world's Columbian Exposition, commonly called the Chicago World's Fair, opened on May 1, 1893, showcasing American progress and innovation on a scale never before seen. The fairgrounds, designed by renowned architect Daniel Burnham, featured neoclassical buildings painted gleaming white, creating the famous White City that symbolized America's vision of utopian urbanism. The contrast between Burnham's White City and Holmes's dark castle separated by just a few miles, could not have been more stark. One celebrated humanity's highest aspirations, the other served its basest impulses. The fair drew over 27 million visitors during its 6-month run, an extraordinary number considering the U.S. population was then approximately 65 million. Each day, thousands of wide-eyed tourists arrived in Chicago, many staying in hastily constructed hotels and boarding houses throughout the city. Holmes's establishment, which he sometimes called the World's Fair Hotel, targeted young women traveling alone, offering clean rooms, employment opportunities, and the promise of safety. His method of selecting victims revealed both calculation and opportunism. Holmes favored young women with few local connections, typically those who had recently arrived in Chicago and whose disappearances might go unnoticed. He employed some as typists or sales clerks in his pharmacy, establishing trust before eventually killing them. Others were romantic conquests. Holmes, despite being married multiple times, often committing bigamy, possessed considerable charm, and used it effectively to lure potential victims. The exact number of people murdered in the murder castle remains unknown. Holmes eventually confessed to 27 killings, but some contemporaneous accounts place the number as high as 200. Modern historians and crime researchers generally estimate the true count at between 20 and 30 confirmed victims, though the actual figure may never be established with certainty. What can be established is the methodical nature of Holmes's crimes. Unlike many murderers who kill in passion or frenzy, Holmes approached murder with the same clinical detachment he had displayed in medical school dissections. He kept meticulous records of his victims' belongings, often selling skeletons to medical schools and taking out life insurance policies on employees who subsequently disappeared. Throughout the World's Fair period, Holmes operated with impunity. Police attention was focused on managing the massive crowds and preventing petty crime around the fairgrounds. Missing persons reports, particularly for young women who had arrived from elsewhere, received minimal investigation. In the excitement and chaos of the fair, Holmes found perfect conditions for his crimes. The murder castle itself burned partially in August 1895, after Holmes had been arrested for other crimes. The fire's origin remains disputed. Some accounts suggest it was arson intended to destroy evidence, while others attribute it to business associates trying to collect insurance. What's certain is that the building's true horrors were only discovered afterward, when police investigations revealed the elaborate mechanisms of murder Holmes had constructed. The building stood for several more decades, becoming an object of macabre tourism, until it was finally demolished in 1938. Today, a post office stands on the site, an unremarkable replacement for what was once the physical embodiment of one man's methodical evil. Part 4. The Business of Murder. While the murder castle served as Holmes's primary killing ground, his criminal enterprises extended far beyond murder. He was, in many respects, a businessman who integrated killing into a diverse portfolio of fraud and deception. Understanding Holmes requires recognizing that he saw murder not merely as an end in itself, but as a component of more complex financial schemes. Holmes's business operations were remarkably varied. He ran the drugstore legitimately, earning a steady income and establishing his public persona as a respectable pharmacist. He invested in several patents, including an improved gas meter and a novel vending machine design. He speculated in real estate, buying and selling properties throughout Englewood. On paper, Dr. H. Holmes appeared to be a successful small businessman riding the wave of Chicago's economic boom. Beneath this veneer of respectability, however, ran currents of fraud that financed his lifestyle and building projects. He routinely ordered supplies on credit with no intention of payment, moving operations to new company names when creditors pressed too hard. He sold fake miracle cures and tonics through mail-order advertisements. He orchestrated elaborate real estate swindles, selling properties he didn't own or taking payment for fictitious investments. Insurance fraud became a particular specialty. Holmes would take out policies on business associates, employees, or romantic partners, then stage their disappearances or deaths to collect the proceeds. This pattern would eventually lead to his downfall, but for years, it provided substantial income. The murder operations themselves reflected Holmes's business mindset. He extracted maximum value from his victims, collecting their possessions, selling their skeletons to medical institutions, and occasionally claiming their life insurance. Nothing was wasted. Even the disposal of bodies was integrated into the building's heating system. Holmes maintained detailed ledgers recording expenses and profits from various enterprises, including items taken from victims. These accounts, discovered after his arrest, revealed a mind that viewed murder as simply another transaction, a means of acquiring assets, while eliminating liabilities in the form of witnesses or accomplices who knew too much. This commercial approach to killing distinguished Holmes from other murderers of his era. While Jack the Ripper terrorized London with apparently motiveless slayings, Holmes operated more like a corporate predator, calculating costs, managing risks, and maximizing returns. His victims were not selected primarily for personal gratification, but for their utility in his broader schemes. The social conditions of Gilded Age America created perfect conditions for Holmes's operations. The period saw minimal government regulation of business, limited communication between law enforcement agencies in different jurisdictions, and weak systems for verifying identities or credentials. Holmes exploited these systemic weaknesses, moving between cities and identities whenever necessary to evade detection. Chicago itself, with its rapid growth and commercial energy, provided both cover and opportunity. The city's business community valued initiative and novelty, viewing regulations as impediments to progress. Its legal system struggled to keep pace with population growth, leaving significant gaps in oversight. In this environment, a man who presented well and spoke confidently could orchestrate extraordinary crimes with minimal scrutiny. Holmes's manipulation of these conditions revealed a sophisticated understanding of his society's blind spots. He recognized that in a mobile, commercially driven America, people were evaluated primarily by their apparent success rather than their histories or connections. By projecting prosperity and professional accomplishment, he deflected the questions that might have exposed his true nature. This insight, that appearances mattered more than substance in the emerging American metropolis, represented Holmes's most profound exploitation of his era's vulnerabilities. He created a persona that perfectly aligned with his society's values and aspirations, making him not an obvious threat but a model of achievement. As the World's Fair concluded in October 1893, Holmes might have appeared at the height of his success. His hotel had hosted numerous guests, his businesses showed apparent prosperity, and his crimes remained undiscovered. Yet the complex web of fraud he had constructed was beginning to unravel, setting in motion events that would expose not just his murders, but also the social conditions that had allowed them to continue for so long. Part V. The Web of Deception. As Chicago dismantled the gleaming white city in late 1893, Holmes's financial situation grew increasingly precarious. Years of unpaid debts, double-dealing, and fraud had created a tangled network of creditors and claimants. With the end of the World's Fair, the stream of potential victims diminished, while demands from those he had defrauded intensified. Rather than retrench, Holmes escalated his schemes. In July 1894, he left Chicago with his longtime associate Benjamin Pittezel, ostensibly to pursue business opportunities in Fort Worth, Texas. Their real plan was an elaborate insurance fraud that would become Holmes's undoing. The scheme centered on faking Pittezel's death to collect a $10,000 life insurance policy from the Fidelity Mutual Life Association. Holmes convinced Pittezel to find a corpse resembling himself, which they would present as Pittezel's body after a supposed laboratory explosion. Pittezel would then hide while Holmes collected the insurance money, which they would split before establishing new identities. Instead, Holmes saw an opportunity to eliminate a partner who knew too much about his past crimes. On September 2, 1894, in Philadelphia, Holmes actually murdered Pittezel, not with violence but with chloroform while his associate was intoxicated. He arranged the body to suggest an accidental explosion, complete with chemicals placed strategically around the room. The plan initially succeeded. A Philadelphia coroner identified the body as Pittezel's, and Holmes began the process of claiming the insurance money. But the scheme required additional deceptions that would prove unsustainable. Holmes had promised Pitezel's wife, Carrie, that her husband was alive and in hiding. To maintain this fiction while collecting the insurance payout, Holmes convinced Carrie to allow 3 of her 5 children, Alice, 15, Nellie, 11, and Howard, 8, to travel with him, supposedly to reunite with their father. What followed was a bizarre journey across the American Midwest and into Canada, with Holmes moving the children from city to city while corresponding with their mother to maintain the illusion that they would soon rejoin their father. In reality, Holmes murdered all 3 children, Howard in Indianapolis and the girls in Toronto, disposing of their bodies with the same clinical efficiency he had shown in Chicago. Meanwhile, the insurance company had grown suspicious about the Pitezel claim. Though they had initially paid the $10,000, irregularities in the case prompted them to hire the Pinkerton detective agency to investigate. The Pinkertons assigned operative Frank Geyer to the case, a veteran detective who would become Holmes's nemesis. Geyer began tracking Holmes's movements through hotel registries and witness accounts. The detective's methodology was painstaking but effective. He interviewed hotel clerks, landlords, and shopkeepers across multiple cities, gradually reconstructing Holmes's journey with the Pitezel children. His investigation became one of the first examples of systematic detective work across jurisdictional boundaries in American law enforcement history. In July 1895, Geyer discovered the bodies of Alice and Nellie Pitezel buried in the cellar of a house Holmes had rented in Toronto. A month later, investigators found Howard's remains in Indianapolis. These discoveries transformed what had appeared to be an insurance fraud case into a nationwide manhunt for a serial killer. Holmes, unaware that Geyer was closing in, had already been arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894, for an unrelated horse swindle. While in custody, investigators began connecting him to the Pitezel insurance fraud and eventually to the murders of the Pitezel children. As authorities delved deeper into Holmes's background, the true scope of his crimes began to emerge. Chicago police searched the building at 63rd and Wallace Streets, discovering the architectural horrors Holmes had constructed. Former employees came forward with accounts of strange sounds and suspicious activities. Records of missing persons who had been connected to Holmes were re-examined. The picture that emerged was of criminality on an unprecedented scale, not just in the number of victims, but in the methodical planning behind the murders. Holmes had created what amounted to an industrial process for killing, processing, and profiting from human beings. When confronted with mounting evidence, Holmes displayed the adaptability that had characterized his criminal career. He offered multiple contradictory confessions, sometimes admitting to dozens of murders, other times claiming innocence of all but insurance fraud. He sold his story to the newspapers, writing a memoir filled with sensationalistic claims and self-serving distortions. The public's fascination with Holmes was immediate and intense. Newspapers across America carried front-page coverage of the case, with headlines proclaiming him a modern Bluebeard and the arch-fiend. His crimes seemed to embody anxieties about modernity itself, the fear that urban anonymity and scientific knowledge could combine to create new forms of evil. Holmes's trial for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel began in Philadelphia on October 28, 1895. The proceedings lasted just 5 days, with the jury deliberating only 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison. Before his execution, Holmes made one final curious request, that his coffin be encased in cement and buried 10 feet deep. He claimed to fear that his body would be stolen for dissection, the same fate he had reportedly inflicted on many of his victims. This last wish was granted, adding a final macabre note to a case that had captivated and horrified the nation. Part 6. Legacy of Darkness. The execution of H. Holmes did not end America's fascination with his crimes. If anything, his death marked the beginning of his transformation from murderer to mythological figure, a process that continues to shape how we understand both Holmes himself and the era that produced him. In the immediate aftermath of his execution, newspapers and publishers capitalized on public interest with lurid accounts of the murder castle, and its architect. These early narratives often exaggerated Holmes's crimes, attributing to him dozens or even hundreds of murders beyond those that could be verified. These exaggerations stemmed partly from Holmes's own contradictory confessions and partly from the commercial incentives of yellow journalism. The 1895 book Holmes' Own Story, purportedly written by the killer himself but heavily edited by publishers, established many of the myths that would surround him. In it, Holmes portrayed himself as brilliant but misunderstood, driven by forces beyond his control. This self-mythologizing found receptive audiences in a society already fascinated by emerging theories of criminal psychology. By the early 20th century, Holmes had been incorporated into a developing narrative about the dark underbelly of American progress. His crimes were seen as emblematic of the moral risks posed by urbanization, anonymity, and materialistic values. The fact that he had operated during the World's Fair, that celebration of American achievement, made him a perfect symbol of the Gilded Age's contradictions. This symbolic dimension helps explain the enduring place Holmes occupies in American cultural memory. Unlike many murderers whose crimes fade from public consciousness, Holmes has remained a subject of fascination through books, films, and television programs. Erik Larson's 2003 bestseller, The Devil in the White City, which juxtaposed Holmes's crimes with Daniel Burnham's creation of the World's Fair, introduced him to new generations and reinforced his status as a dark counterpoint to American progress. Beyond popular culture, Holmes's case left tangible legacies in American law enforcement and security practices. The interstate investigation led by Detective Geyer demonstrated the need for better coordination between police departments across jurisdictional boundaries. Insurance companies implemented more rigorous verification procedures for death claims, and urban hotels instituted stricter registration requirements, partially in response to public fears stirred by Holmes's exploitation of transient accommodations. More broadly, the Holmes case contributed to emerging discussions about criminal psychology and the nature of evil in the modern world. His crimes occurred at a pivotal moment when traditional religious explanations of evil were being challenged by scientific and psychological theories. Was Holmes possessed by demons, as some religious commentators suggested, or was he an example of a new clinical category, the psychopath, as early criminologists proposed? This debate reflected deeper tensions in American society as it transitioned from Victorian moral certainties to the more ambiguous ethical landscape of the 20th century. Holmes seemed to require a new vocabulary of evil, one that acknowledged the possibility of rational, calculated malevolence without obvious motive or madness. The architectural embodiment of Holmes's crimes, the murder castle itself, became a powerful metaphor for concealed evil. Though the building was never fully operational as the elaborate death trap described in sensationalized accounts, its hidden rooms and passages suggested that beneath the orderly surface of modern life lurked unseen dangers. This architectural metaphor extended to Holmes himself. His respectable facade, doctor, businessman, charming conversationalist, concealed interior chambers of horrific intent. This discrepancy between external appearance and internal reality spoke to anxieties about identity in an increasingly mobile and anonymous society. How could one truly know the stranger next door or the charming hotelier? Today, more than a century after his death, Holmes occupies an ambiguous place in American criminal history. He is undoubtedly one of the nation's most notorious murderers, yet the exact scope of his crimes remains disputed. Modern scholars have questioned some of the more extreme estimates of his victim count, suggesting that while Holmes was clearly a serial killer, the number of his victims was likely closer to 20 than the 200 claimed in sensationalistic accounts. This historical reassessment, however, has done little to diminish Holmes's symbolic significance. He continues to represent the dark potential of modernity, the fear that technological progress and social mobility might create not just new opportunities, but new manifestations of evil. The story of H. Holmes remains compelling precisely because it transcends the boundaries of conventional crime narratives. It is simultaneously the tale of a particular murderer and an allegory about American society at a pivotal moment of transition. In Holmes's methodical crimes, we glimpse not just individual pathology, but the pathologies of an age, the shadow side of progress, innovation, and reinvention. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Holmes's legacy is how thoroughly he embodied the values of his era, even as he perverted them to monstrous ends. He was, in his way, an entrepreneur and innovator, qualities celebrated in Gilded Age America. He understood and exploited the systems of his time, from medical education to insurance to real estate development. His crimes revealed not just personal depravity, but the vulnerabilities created by rapid social change and unfettered commercial development. In this sense, H. Holmes was not an aberration from Gilded Age America, but its dark reflection, a figure who showed how the same conditions that enabled unprecedented progress could also enable unprecedented evil. This recognition perhaps explains our continued fascination with his crimes. In exploring Holmes's darkness, we explore the shadows cast by our own brightest achievements. Epilogue: The Monster and the Modern. The case of H. Holmes marked a watershed in America's understanding of crime and evil. Before Holmes, the nation's conception of murder had been largely shaped by traditional narratives of passion, revenge, or obvious insanity. After Holmes, Americans were forced to confront the possibility of methodical, calculated killing, murder as process rather than impulse. This shift paralleled broader changes in American society at the dawn of the 20th century. The nation was becoming more systematic, more scientific, more organized in all aspects of life, from factory production to urban planning to business management. Holmes represented the application of these same principles to murder, and this perhaps explains why his crimes proved so unsettling. He showed how modernity's tools could serve the darkest human impulses. In the decades following Holmes's execution, America would experience more serial killers, some with higher victim counts, others with more bizarre motivations. Yet Holmes retains a unique place in this grim pantheon, not just as one of the first documented cases, but as one most clearly intertwined with his historical moment. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 had been designed to showcase America's arrival as a global power, a nation capable of technological and cultural achievements rivaling those of Europe. In retrospect, Holmes's simultaneous activities a few miles away seem to offer a counter-narrative, a demonstration that progress brought with it new forms of danger. Today, the site of the murder castle in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood gives no hint of its gruesome history. The post office that replaced Holmes's building stands as a utilitarian reminder that life continues, that even the darkest histories eventually recede into memory. Yet the questions raised by Holmes's crimes remain relevant. In our own age of rapid technological change and social disconnection, his case continues to resonate as a warning about the potential costs of progress without corresponding ethical development. Holmes exploited the gaps created by modernization, the spaces where traditional community oversight had weakened, but new regulatory systems had not yet emerged. Similar gaps exist in our digital world, where identity can be as easily constructed and discarded as it was in Holmes's physical realm. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Holmes case is the reminder that evil adapts to its environment. It finds expression through the tools and opportunities of its age. In the Gilded Age, that meant exploiting urban anonymity, manipulating business regulations, and weaponizing scientific knowledge. In our time, the specific mechanisms differ, but the fundamental pattern, adapting malevolence to current conditions, remains the same. This adaptability makes monsters like Holmes particularly difficult to identify and stop. By superficially embodying the values of their society, they hide in plain sight. Holmes appeared to be exactly what Gilded Age America celebrated: enterprising, educated, professionally successful. It was this conformity to external expectations that allowed his deviance to go undetected for so long. The story of H. Holmes remains at its core a cautionary tale about the blind spots created by rapid social change. As America rushed toward its future in the final decades of the 19th century, it created conditions where someone like Holmes could operate with minimal scrutiny. His crimes thus represent not just individual evil but systemic vulnerability, the darker consequences of progress untempered by careful oversight and community connection. In the end, Holmes embodied a particular kind of American nightmare, the fear that beneath our most cherished narratives of advancement and opportunity lurk possibilities for exploitation and predation. His case reminds us that the same conditions that foster innovation and prosperity can, if not properly managed, create spaces where monsters thrive. As the lights dimmed on the White City of the World's Fair in October 1893, they also illuminated, however briefly, the shadowy architecture Holmes had constructed nearby. In that contrast, between the idealized city of the future and the castle built for murder, we glimpse the fundamental tension of modernity itself, how to harness progress for human betterment while guarding against its capacity to amplify our darkest impulses. H. Holmes was not just America's first serial killer. He was the harbinger of a distinctly modern form of evil, one that continues to evolve alongside our societies, adapting to each new phase of human development. His legacy endures not just in the historical record of his specific crimes, but in our ongoing struggle to create systems that foster progress while protecting against predation. In an age of miracles, he showed us what devils might look like. And in doing so, he compelled America to recognize that advancement without ethical development creates not utopia, but opportunity for unprecedented harm.